Let's talk about Ancestral Shadows by Russell Kirk. So Russell Kirk was a philosopher, editor, an essayist, an occasional teacher, generally speaking, an influential intellectual historian of the 20th century, particularly in America. And he was also, kind of strangely, but not so strangely perhaps, a ghost story writer, and a very well respected one as well. Not someone most of us will have heard of, especially as a ghost story writer, but nonetheless, maybe the most important ghost story writer of the second half of the 20th century. And the back of the book shows the regard in which he was held, that there are blurbs by Ray Bradbury of Fahrenheit 451 and The Illustrated Man, and Madeleine L'Engle of A Stitch in Time, who both say, so for instance, Bradbury says, he deserves to be considered a fine writer and an amazing thinker in literature and in politics. And L'Engle says, Russell Kirk is a compelling storyteller at a time when contemporary fiction sadly lacks a sense of story. There's also a quote from a letter from T.S. Eliot, the great poet, to Kirk. How amazingly versatile and prolific you are. Now you've written what I should have least expected of you. Ghost stories. And I think it is intended as a compliment, rather than as a backhanded compliment and an insult. This collection, Ancestral Shadows, this contains, I think, all of his ghost stories, which are, I think, 19 of his 22 short stories that were published. It lacks 3 short stories, I believe, which are not, they're excluded because they're not ghost stories. These are the 19 ghost stories. He also wrote 3 novels, of which all in some way sort of connect into his interest in this book. 2 are ghost story novels, and 1 shares a character with the book, with the short stories. So I should define what a ghost story is for our purposes. How does it differ from horror? Well, very usefully, there is a short piece on the ghostly tale by Kirk at the back, showing what his view was. And it's useful. The better uncanny stories are underlain by a healthy concept of the character of evil. Defying nature, the necromancer conjures up what ought not to rise again this side of Judgment Day. But these dark powers do not rule the universe. By bell, book and candle, symbolically at least, we can push them down under. So, one thing there you notice that though we might think ghost stories are a type of horror, and the idea of a necromancer and book, bell and candle might make us think of The Exorcist, the central dynamic is quite different to the typical horror. I would say, though the difference can be subtle, of course there's always genre bleed, the typical ghost story emphasises discomforting suspense, mystery, dawning realisation, and in a lot of authors like Kirk there's a moral dynamic as well. The idea that in some way there is a recovery of moral order through the story. Horror, on the other hand, is a broad genre again, but it often involves more particularly allegories of specific identity and cultural issues, using the external situation, the horror, to reflect an internal conflict. And there's not necessarily a moral dynamic in that, whereas I think virtually every great ghost story writer has had a pretty explicitly moral view of the matter. Now, Kirk, fittingly, given what you've heard there, he's got an ornate and attractive style. He's very nice to read. To put it this way, my dad, who read one story here and didn't want to read any more, said, "Oh, it's beautifully written." It fit, it just wasn't his genre, but it fits the gothic trappings of the genre. The idea that you have old and strange things that are not fully understood by human kind. His structure struggles a bit in some early stories and gets better over time. Some of the early stories are a little uneven, or they're more warped by obvious bugbears of Kirk. There's a couple of times where you find out he really hates town planners and anyone in an allied business, to a point you're like, okay man, calm down. But that becomes integrated. The moral concerns, the frustrations he has and the concerns he has become integrated with the structure of the ghost story, and the catharsis becomes more satisfying because of that. Some of these are pretty straight ghost stories of the type you'd expect, where there's a mystery and there's some sort of supernatural solution that's maybe spiritual, as opposed to there's a werewolf. The idea of that, as they say, stressful, discomforting suspense, a mystery leading to revelation. What Shadows We Pursue is a bit like that, for instance. The Princess of Orleans. And there are others too that straddle that and maybe some other genres like A Long Long Trail of Winding is like that. Some are less obviously traditional ghost stories, or at least they're touching on other supernatural or semi-supernatural tropes. Saviour Gate, for instance, The Last God's Dream. And Kirk has a sideline in striking characters as well. That's something else I want to say. Frank Sarsfield and Manfred Arcane, star of 2 of his novels and a number of short stories here. These are distinctive characters you remember when you come away from it. And even sometimes a single story character. Those 2 star in multiple, or at least appear in multiple. But there's also sometimes a passing character. Uncle Isaiah in the eponymous story is definitely a memorable character. They're not necessarily intensely deep characters. The length of a short story doesn't usually allow that. Arcane is different. Arcane feels like a lived-in character. But they're very pungent characters, they're very memorable characters, they're very compelling characters. You definitely come away remembering them and being affected by them. There's a concern he has. I've mentioned characters appearing again. He also creates a little world. There is a degree of sub-creation of a setting, almost, we'd call it elsewhere in sci-fi and fantasy. There are intra-canonical links, including with his novels. 4 of these 19 stories in some way connect with Manfred Arcane, who appears in 2 of the novels. 3 connect with Frank Sarsfield, 2 with Captain Bane. Kirk cares, I think, it seems to me, about his sub-created world. It's not that he comes to his world and says, well, what's the story I write today? Oh, I'll stick that guy in. Oh, okay, this is the, It's not just tossed out on the page. There is an internal logic to the setting, as well as to the moral dynamic. And I think the 2 obviously connect, that there is a kind of coherence in the world which should be reflected in the way the world is built. So the fact there is this nascent setting, particularly around Arcane, which shows a whole worldview, is as interesting as any other setting that is well written, albeit there's, generally speaking, less of it. It's fair to say, in connection to that he generally gets atmosphere and location perfectly. He writes descriptively very well. I've already kind of mentioned his style, but part of the ghost story, part of the discomforting suspense, is the knowledge that you're stepping across a liminal zone. It's not that you're sitting somewhere completely normal and then you simply have a shiver down your spine. You can't explain it at the end. You enter the liminal zone. You cross over into the ramshackle Scottish mansion or laird's hall, or you are in the rough part of town and you're a priest at the church in the roughest part of town, and you're dealing with the very worst of the locals and trying to in some way engage them with spiritual and moral things. He gets those descriptions perfectly, and more than anything else, he gets the key things right. Really, he gets the discomforting suspense that leads to catharsis, that is central to the ghost story. There's often justice meted out in a strange manner, that when the wicked had thought they had escaped. Sometimes there's a revelation that solves a puzzle of time and space and whatever else. You think, how could that work? I don't understand why this says this. That's a common thing he pulls off very well. And sometimes there's just an emotional resolution at the close of a crisis. A character integrates himself or herself with the world. And that happens through this supernatural, strange and spooky crisis. So I'm obviously in favour of Ancestral Shadows by Russell Kirk. You need to want to read the genre. It's not a genre many people read. You're going to need, in that sense, to have a strong stomach, but also you're going to need to be willing to engage imaginatively with that moral worldview, even if you don't share it. It is something where when you come to a writer who has a view on the world, as every writer does, but a writer where that informs the central dynamic of the story, you have to suspend your disbelief when you come into that. But if those caveats don't scare you off, I'd thoroughly recommend this if you can get it secondhand. There are some stories online as well, or recorded versions that you could listen to. And yeah, if you have read it, please tell me what you thought in the comments. Till next time.